Hello and welcome to In the Loop, the podcast series by LoopNet, where we explore some of the stories, ideas and the people behind the world of commercial real estate. I'm Phil Hazelhurst and today I'm here in Northern Virginia in Arlington, or more specifically, I'm actually right in the middle of an exciting new project called National Landing. And what's happening here at National Landing is really fascinating. Effectively, an entire district or kind of town zone has been reimagined, rethought, and is being redeveloped from the ground up at times. And all of that's being done with modern principles in terms of the workplace, but also the way that people live and relate to their work in the towns and the spaces that they occupy. So I'm here today to meet with Evan Regan Levine, and he's the Chief Strategy Officer at JBG Smith. JBG Smith is the company behind all of this regeneration and redevelopment. And so I'm really interested to meet with Evan and find out more about the ideas behind this place and what it takes to think about a project of this scope and of this scale. So I'm going to head inside, meet with Evan, and we'll get started. Welcome to In the Loop.
Thank you.
I'd love for you to start by telling us a little bit about this place. Where are we, and what's the story of what's happening here all around us?
Sounds great. So we're sitting in what we call our Experience Center, which is really a storytelling room and space that we have at the center of the neighborhood called National Landing. National Landing is the neighborhoods of Crystal City, Pentagon City, and Potomac Yard together as one large market. It's pretty much a city-scale real estate project.
For somebody like me who's not in that world in the same way that you are, can you just describe some of the things that go on behind the scenes when it comes to approaching a project like that? How does it work, and what are you doing?
I think the reason it works is because it's that scale. And I think this is a fascinating one, but just to understand a little bit of background, we're sitting in Arlington, Virginia, and part of the project actually sits in Alexandria. So we straddle two different jurisdictions, a county and a city, and we are immediately adjacent to Washington, D.C., so right across the river. And this was a project at a place that had its genesis in the 1960s with the idea of expanding federal government, taking and building out new low-cost spaces and land that had largely been industrial. We're next to Reagan National Airport, which was built and expanded on fill into the water. So this was a place that was sort of this interstitial place between, Old Town Alexandria and Mount Vernon and the city. And it had its evolution, but its evolution was really around this notion of 1960s Euclidean planning principles. So people said, I'm going to get in my car, I'm going to drive to the office zoned environment, and I'm going to actually, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, I'm not going to even leave the conditioned spaces to do my shopping, go to restaurants, get lunch, do anything. And so it evolved over time to be this effectively sort of office park outside the Pentagon, which we're also next to the Potomac, near the centers of power, but it was never really designed around people-focused planning. And so the reality is that worked really well up until the base realignment and closure process, which really impacted a lot of military facilities, DoD facilities, where they moved the military out of leased space and into owned space. And that created both an opportunity and a challenge for this market, which had historically been home to groups like Patent and Trademark Office and largely Department of Defense and others, that it had to be reinvented and reimagined. In many ways, it was a shock to the system that was similar to what the rest of the world would go through with the COVID-19 pandemic later on. And it created an opportunity because it created a lot of distress in this place. It was an office market that just didn't have anything else to offer. It didn't have residential, it didn't have retail, it needed to be reinvented, but it had extraordinary bones. And it's hard when you think about, as a real estate investor, targeting a single asset in a place like that, where you can't change the tenor or the character of the place because you control one asset. You had to be able to have this unique scale and control position to be able to change that neighborhood, which was this struggling office park on the Potomac, into something that would be viable for the future. And that's where, when we had the opportunity to come take this project as a whole through this merger that we did, the spin merge with Vornado in 2017, we jumped at the chance to have the control because we could take a whole city. And that wasn't just greenfield, by the way. It wasn't saying, oh, we'll go develop the perfect city from scratch. It was, how can we reimagine this place that's embedded in the core of the nation's capital, or the capital of the free world, however you want to think about it. That was a really exciting challenge.
And so when you approach that reimagining process, going from, as you were describing it, a kind of one purpose zone into something new, what are the considerations, what are the trends, the influences on the decision-making process around those plans?
So the first thing we knew we had to do when we started looking at this was it had to go from being a strictly office environment to a mixed-use environment. And that today sounds, very straightforward. That's the simplest thing that you'd want to do. But it was challenging in that we had to find ways to blend that with an existing urban core and urban fabric. And so the first thing that we did is we figured out where can we take our office inventory, which was pretty massive. It was over 7 million feet that we controlled alone, over 65% of the market, I think, at the time. And we figured out which buildings are functionally obsolete, which can we take offline and reduce that office inventory, which is, by the way, something that we've been doing steadily, that the pandemic, I'd say, accelerated, but at the same time, we'd always had this view that this place had too much office, not enough other uses. So we took some office offline with the goal of creating multifamily first. We knew we had to have people live here. Then we knew that if we were going to have people live here, we had to replan the retail environment. One of the challenges in this place was that a lot of the retail was below grade. And it was sort of a fad, obviously, from the 60s into the 90s, not only to sort of emulate the idea of an enclosed mall, but to do these kind of underground shopping complexes. And over time, it really hadn't worked. It was an idea that was interesting, and it's interesting in places like Toronto, where it's cold more of the year. But here, we generally have 4 seasons.
People don't really want to be underground.
They want to walk around. They want to be outside. It wants to be a real city. And so that had largely failed by the time we got here. But it was the idea of saying, how do we bring that retail to the street level and pair it with this new concept of adding housing into the market and do it largely on office sites or in front of office buildings and in that existing fabric? Because we knew that for the retail to be successful, not only did it have to have anchors like grocery that could serve the neighborhood, but it had to be anchored by a retail main street. And that was another hierarchical challenge for us in understanding. And you look at the floor map, most office parks don't have main streets. It's really challenging. They were built, with this sort of Corbusier idea of these, garden cities and these like perfect functional machines for living that were really designed around, again, how do you move cars efficiently out of spaces? It wasn't about where do you create that main street. So we targeted one street and we focused very heavily on that street and a couple that sort of branched off of it to create that main street density and fill in what we called missing teeth in the streetscape where there were holes, whether it was for loading docks or office buildings. And we found ways to introduce in our plan new multifamily housing, new retail that was in front of those buildings, or reconfiguring building lobbies so they weren't set back in these big suburban drop-offs, but instead came out to the street. And that's the plan that we've largely followed. But it was important for us to have that plan in place so that when an anchor like Amazon came along, they could see that there was a vision for this that was more than an office park.
In a way, it feels like a kind of reversion to an older way of planning a town or a place where people live and work. You think about European cities and this kind of mixture of workplace and retail place and leisure all being blended into one. It's quite common, and it feels like this is, in a way, like a kind of return to that, but obviously with new and modern ideas. So tell me about some of the modern and kind of future-forward influences on planning spaces and places like this.
I think first, I just want to comment on your initial sort of remark there. I think you're totally correct. And I think that we have gone through a period, and this is just sort of stretching back, of embracing humanity in design and making human-centered design important. And there was a period where we wanted to force, following the Industrial Revolution, we had a lot of sort of planning and architectural design principles around optimization, around optimizing humans as components of a machine. And that machine really lent itself to productivity and to the sort of embracing the factory model and applying that not only to office space, but to entire neighborhoods. And this was a place that was built for efficiency, for cost, for speed. It was a machine. And that machine worked for a number of years, but its fundamental flaw was that it lacked the humanity that informed earlier iterations of city planning, design, architecture. And the opportunity here, and which I think you're seeing obviously permeate our space in general as real estate developers and planners and designers, is that you have an ability to bring that humanity back in. And so a lot of what we would consider now future-looking, proofing types of design, we do things like one of our multifamily towers that's sitting right of the window outside us embraces biophilic design. It has a terracotta facade. We have extensive planting network, irrigation, et cetera. The biophilic design, by the way, tested, we do focus groups research, things like that on design, tested better than anything we had ever seen. And we took that super block that was a very efficient block where that building is built. It was an old government office building. It took up a huge street with no breaks in the street at all. So if you're a pedestrian and you're walking, you go past this big, unbroken, flat facade of a government building because all the life was meant to happen in the building and afterwards at a differently zoned place that you would leave this place to get to. And so we split that block in two. We created a curbless street in between the buildings, and we embraced the alley condition that largely in this place had been kind of subsumed into its underground mall condition. Instead, we broke that up and we created these shorter, smaller blocks. And we actually put a lot of that neighborhood serving retail into the alley. And we created this condition where it felt much more livable, much less efficient, but it was trying to reduce the scale of a place like this while at the same time making a 300-foot tall tower with a view of everything around DC feel like something that was manageable for a person to interact with. And I think as we talk, you'll hear that as sort of a recurring theme of our job was to take this really efficient machine and break it a little bit to make it a little bit more relatable and human.
If we zoom out and we think about the broader picture, not just in this place, but in general, it strikes me that many urban places will identify with some of the things that you've been talking about, very large scale buildings that are designed with the inside in mind rather than the gaps in between. What do you think, how do you feel about the future of downtown office districts in general, business parks? Do you feel like this kind of transformation is scalable and can happen nationwide or globally? How do you see that?
I do. I think that we were lucky in a way that this place, like I said before, had already been through that demand shock. And so it gave us a head start on trying to figure out how we could remake it. But I think there are some key ingredients that are challenging for a lot of these places and challenging to make the model scalable. The first is you have to have a lot of scale and control. I mean, we could not do, like I said, what we were talking about here without lots of different control. And we did things like, we'll talk about, there's a place called the Water Park, which was an underutilized public space that it was privately owned, and it was a fountain and some hardscape. And it was not an appealing or attractive place. It was a lot of concrete aggregate. And we said, how do we introduce these little kiosks for retailers? And they were retailers who typically you wouldn't get in a big new development because they typically were local operators, a lot of women, minority owned, smaller groups who had trouble getting access to capital. We looked at this and said, let's create an incubator and let's make that incubator for all these kind of local interesting businesses and let's put that in the park. Well, that's something that, at best, that's going to be break even. People pay us, they don't pay any fixed rent, they pay a percentage of their sales. So it's a place that can help people get their start, but that's very important for making it feel like a neighborhood, but it's not going to make a lot of money. Same thing when we were doing we put a movie theater in, an Alamo Theater. We tore up a deal with another nationally known, cinema chain. We had a national coffee shop in place. We went to a smaller operator. And the reality is those operators typically don't have the same credit. They don't pay the same rent. Oftentimes they'll fail and you'll have to replace them. And we learned those lessons. But without that scale and control, it's very hard to make those kinds of decisions because if I just own that park, that would be a terrible economic decision. I have to own a lot around it to say I have to bet on the uplift of the entire place and I can make those decisions for a neighborhood. And that's where a lot of big downtowns and other districts, you don't have that control player who says, I can make these calls, I can make these decisions, these economic choices, because if you're a city, you can't force the owners to do it. And if you're owners, you say, well, why am I going to be the one who takes that economic hit? And I look at, one project I really admire that's local is the Union Market District that Edens did. They were amazingly able to build out a food hall, but they also bought up a lot of density and development rights around it. They created the retail place, they sold the density off, but now there are a lot of different owners, but they controlled enough to shape the place and add that value early. I think that's a trend that you're going to have to see. So the business park has to have that concentrated ownership at scale to really see a transformation that can happen at that city level. So I think there's hope. I think there's a playbook. I think we've shown in some ways, without being arrogant about it, that you can reimagine these places and have success with attracting office tenants and apartment tenants and retail. But it has to be something that's done really intentionally because it's not as simple as let's just do surgery on one building.
And it requires some bold decisions because some of the things that you just described there, they may feel counter to the kind of usual business logic or kind of economic logic of monetizing real estate, right? So JBG Smith is a REIT, you're investing in this place. Tell me about the broader strategy for JBG Smith and how this approach is being implemented across the whole portfolio.
Sure. So, people are often curious. We say JBG Smith is a REIT. Well, JBG has had so many different iterations. When it was founded, Ironically, it was a law firm that then started doing syndicated real estate deals, and then in the 90s raised closed-end private equity funds. We raised 9 closed-end private equity funds before going public. And to us, we're largely capital agnostic. You'll still see us do a lot of joint ventures or syndicate out equity. We're not strictly, a REIT in the REIT sense of that's what we are, that's what defines us. I think what defines us is we're very skillful allocators of capital. My partner, George Anders, our chief investment officer, talks about this approach a lot, but we have not been afraid to recycle out of an asset class when we think it's fully priced and into something that's on its face a lot riskier. You see us right now acquiring office buildings because we think we can implement plans like this and change places. Well, a lot of people don't want to acquire office buildings right now, but we're out doing that. And we're selling apartments where we feel like we've added a lot of the value and now we can have an opportunity to exit. Those decisions strategically come back to that DNA of being capital allocators and being disciplined about values, about economics. And so even when you see us take a project like this is a great fit for REIT permanent capital because it gave us the time horizon we needed. Our funds were 10-year closed-end funds with extension options, but we had a really defined period of when we had to get in, develop, improve, do whatever to add the value, and then get out. This was something that, because of its scale, that permanent capital structure of a REIT gave us the flexibility to do a project like this, take it on in its size, and really make those commitments. But every decision we make is still economically motivated. And that's, I think, where a lot of people get lost on projects like this. Just because I'm talking about a break-even, water park incubator doesn't mean that I'm not concerned with extracting the best development yield possible out of our apartment buildings. In fact, that's why I do it. So every time we do a project that on its face is placemaking focused, that is important because if I can placemake in 5,000 square feet, but add 25 cents a rent or shave 6 months off of downtime for 6 million feet, I'm going to go do that because I know it's the right investment. But everything has to be justified at an economic level, not an emotional level. And that discipline is something that's helped us, I think, be really successful in these kinds of projects.
And that's where that breadth in the project and the control that you talk about really starts to yield a huge benefit because you can make those balancing decisions. Break even here, but it drives great value over here because of the overall effect that the place that you're creating.
Exactly.
So something you mentioned just now was about acquiring office buildings, and of course a big story in office at the moment is repurposing. Taking office buildings, turning them into something else. Tell me about how you see that and what you think is going on in that space right now.
Sure. So I think that, again, if you bring it back to the neighborhood for a second, just because we can actually point at some of these examples, think of this as a lab. We started out with all office, over 7 million feet of office. Today, on an effective, actively leased basis, we're around 4.5 million feet of office. So we've taken a lot of office and taken it offline and converted it to other uses. And I think it's one of the benefits of our firm that I talk about a lot is our vertical integration. We have our own development team, our own construction management team, our own office leasing and management teams, investments group. We understand every aspect. We can look at a lot of different optionality. And for us, optionality is always the byword. We want to make sure that we can really think about each project and think about all the different directions it can go. And in this neighborhood, again, coming back to that point, we had so much office that some office buildings we knew were unsavable. And I think you see a lot of people convert buildings and it makes no sense to convert them because they don't work well as conversions. They're economically sort of, let's call it marginal at best, or at worst, they don't work. The floor plate's too deep. The building presents, the wrong ceiling heights, the wrong, challenges with a lot of excess space you can't figure out what to do with. Those are real problems with doing that. And I think where we looked at some of the buildings that fit that profile, they became land. And we underwrote those as development land with some, interim cash flow. Basically scrape the cash flow, get the building entitled and develop it. And that's what happened with buildings like our 1900 apartments right outside the window there. That was an obsolete building that we scraped. Next building sitting right behind us, that was a building, 1770 Crystal Drive, that had really good dimensions. We were actually studying it for a multifamily conversion. It had a great quarter perimeter depth, it had good glass line, very regular floor plate. But when Amazon came along, they said, we need a building up and running in 18 months. We said, okay, great. That's an area where we had savings from using that structure. And the building was good enough that it could be converted. And so we reskinned that, released it as office. We just, about 2 weeks ago, got approval to take 2 other office buildings that were functionally obsolete, but that were long and narrow, skinny floor plates. And we entitled those, one for a conversion to hotel, the other for conversion to multifamily. And so we're out getting those projects ready to go right now. And we're starting on that process. So I think we look at this from a couple different lenses of one, what can you do with the structure? B, where does that structure yield actual savings? Can you use the parking? Can you salvage the structure? Is there value in that? But also it'll come back like everything else to economics. And here, we have the ability to really be flexible in thinking about our basis, just given how the acquisition happened. But when we're doing new acquisitions, we bought an office building, office park for the first time in 13 years, absent this merger deal. And that was in Tyson's Corner, a place called Tyson's Dulles Plaza. It's a 3-building complex. And one of the things we like about multi-building complexes is we, like here, can control the inventory, control our own supply. So we realize, and I think this is a realization that a lot of people took a long time to come to, office demand is not returning to where it was pre-COVID. It probably wasn't, and we can talk about this ad nauseum. It probably was never there for the past decade, even leading up to COVID. And so that realization that there's probably a smaller net demand pool means that you want to be able to have some office that works, but also create that optionality for where it doesn't. And when we can control a multi-building complex, we can shift tenants, we can move them around, we can create development opportunities, but you can't do that unless those buildings are really, really, really inexpensively priced. And that's, I think, been the big change that we've seen really over the past, call it 18 months, I think, is that you've finally seen between a realization that, rates have been higher for longer. Banks have a lot of underperforming office assets that they've taken back from their sponsors that they need to get out of the system, and that office values may not ever rebound to the same level. There's finally a movement at a low basis to sell some of these assets that actually opens up that optionality we talked about if the building has the right physical characteristics.
Amazon, of course, is a key part of this place, of this neighborhood. And it seems like having an employer, an organization like Amazon on board in a place like this would be a huge part of the recipe for long-term success. What are the considerations when it comes to attracting a business like Amazon to get involved in a project like this? What are they looking for? What do you need to offer to them? What's their vision, and how do you align yourself with that?
It's funny, I'll never forget first meeting we had with Amazon. John Shetler is their now retired head of global real estate. John is an incredible visionary. And even with that, John walked in, and I'll never forget, he looked at me and Matt Kelly and Kai Reynolds, and he said, all right, I get it. But this place, it has access to talent. It has infrastructure. But it has no soul. It's like, it's tumbleweeds. What are we going to do with this? And having that plan that we talked about helped get him there. But I think the first part is having a vision that you can actually convince someone is real. And that comes back to sort of, again, the economic health of the sponsor, your good partnerships with jurisdictions. I mean, Amazon, we talk about bringing them here. That was something that we did in conjunction with Arlington County, the City of Alexandria, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Having those economic development relationships, know your economic developer. Those are the relationships that will go massively far and away to advancing, not only being able to win those anchors, but also to leverage their impact. Because while Amazon brings, 25,000 plus jobs into this market and a lot of growth and an amazing marquee name, and they were a credible catalyst early in our project's history, they were just that. It was a catalyst because they also brought with them state investment in building out a major research university. We have the first building in the Virginia Tech Innovation Campus, the southern end of the market, just opened up. Unbelievable facility focused on master's and PhD level computer engineering, STEM fields, advanced computing. They're really also focused on creating clearable talent. We'll talk about defense tech in a little bit, but the idea is that they brought investment in that university. They also brought investment in building a pedestrian walkable bridge from this market into Reagan National Airport, a new train station for Amtrak and VRE, new metro entrance under construction right outside. Those are impacts that, I think if you were, when we sat down and looked at this, we would say, all right, state, city, et cetera, you should do all these things to enable our development because they're really fundamentally good infrastructure things to do. But in the list of priorities and talking to officials, it's always hard to say, well, do it for my project. When there's a need for those kinds of investments everywhere, Amazon was able to come in and say, we want this, it's part of our deal. Don't give us a bunch of money like a lot of jurisdictions were throwing at a company that's one of the most valuable companies on earth. They said, invest it in the infrastructure, make the place better, let us be a catalyst for positive change. That's why that's so important. And they brought with them some pretty extraordinary infrastructure investments.
Those must have been nerve-wracking meetings for you, meeting with Amazon and talking to them about that vision. There's only a handful of businesses around who have that kind of influence and that kind of pull. What's the backup plan if you don't find someone like Amazon? What do you do instead?
Our original anchor plan was actually to go get Virginia Tech. It was to get a university of some kind, because we thought that, neighborhoods like this, I think you have to think about it in two ways. One is that the anchor can take multiple forms, especially today. It doesn't have to be a large employer. It can be a cultural venue. It can be a university. And you should be really active and thoughtful about how you get creative to enable those uses. And that's an area where if you're going to apply subsidy to something, and you have a project that's of sufficient scale to warrant some kind of either internal subsidy from a company perspective or external from a municipality or a state or some other entity, leveraging that, thoughtful and creative about, hey, it's not just about an employer in an office building. It could be about a research university, a cultural facility or venue, some kind of transit use, anything that differentiates that place. That was always kind of plan A. Amazon was not in our plan when we acquired this. They showed up and it worked because we had consistent ownership and a good vision and a plan and whatever else and great partnerships. But we were always going to go get some kind of anchor and find a way to drive subsidy to that anchor to help reinvent the place. And the other reality is that honestly, some of it was about demand for housing. When we talk about the fact that we as a nation are underbuilt from a housing perspective, we have a massive housing production crisis in this country, and having the ability to take projects offline, reduce that denominator of office inventory to shrink that vacancy rate, it's all about that, then taking that and creating housing or other uses. So that was our other big plan of just saying, look, there's a need for housing. There's not as much of a need for office. Let's go create housing and let's try and anchor it. And that's, I think you could have done those things and can do those things even in places where you're not going to be able to attract an Amazon to be able to launch the transformation.
I'm very interested in what you were just saying about housing demand and kind of that market being underserved. I suppose through the lens of building mixed-use developments, of creating mixed-use places. What's the changing relationship between where people live and where people work, and how's that influencing how you develop in a place like this?
Absolutely. I think about a lot of office parks when you approach that vision of sort of what do office parks want to be. Well, they were built in places that had good accessibility because you had to get people to them. They were generally built for a long time in these very park-like, bucolic settings, and they were generally built, even if they were not mixed use in their character, they are in areas that, from a Euclidean zoning perspective, are somewhat mixed because they're often in those residential nodes. And so I think the housing demand for infill housing, we can't sprawl forever. We can't continue to just sprawl until, you look at cities like Dallas, which has been very successful in many ways because it has produced housing, but Dallas has sprawled to the extent that it's almost reaching the border of Oklahoma. And at a certain point, that means you have to create other nodes closer in, and it becomes, instead of a city, think of it as, the city is the sun and the planet's orbit. It's really these constellations where you have a bunch of different suns and you have lots of smaller orbits around them because the cities have gotten so large. I think the potential with office parks and reimagining them is that you have the ability to add that housing near continued commercial uses, but in infill types of environments. And we think about, the demand for shorter commutes for the 15-minute city. There are ways to accomplish some of that in existing office buildings that exist in those kinds of settings already. And it's not just about, imagine the New York high-rise that you can convert into apartments or condos. It's saying, let's look at a suburban park and figure out, can I take one of the buildings down? Let's say it's a 5-building park. Let's keep 3 of them as office. Let's take one of them down and build townhomes, because there's tremendous demand demographically for an own front door experience. And those low-density multifamily or townhome forms or single-family even, those generally pencil today. They work in an environment where it's more challenging to make other kinds of development work. Then can you add some denser multifamily to the mix on that 4th building in the 5-building park? And suddenly you have something that looks a little bit more like a real city, where those townhomes might border other townhomes or single family houses, and they help transition that density up to then the wood frame, modest multifamily building all the way up to the concrete office building, which at some point can either stay office, those 3, or one of them might become a conversion. But you can create that sort of environment in places that are desirable. Those are the places, most of those office parks that are now struggling are in really good suburban locations that are close to amenities, close to schools, in good neighborhoods, but they need to be reimagined. And that's, by the way, not just a capital or development problem, that is also a jurisdictional problem. And you need to have jurisdictions and authorities and who are willing to be flexible and allow for that transformation to happen, because they can't stay office buildings forever and they're not just going to revert to the earth. So there has to be some great middle ground at some point where you can have supportive jurisdictions to help create that change.
So let's talk more about supportive jurisdictions and policy and its influence on commercial real estate and placemaking. Tell me about what a partnership between a business like JBG Smith and an end user like Amazon and policymakers. What does that look like when it's working at its absolute best?
When it works at its best, it delivers the most important thing possible in that kind of relationship, which is clarity and certainty. It's all about, if I'm a business like Amazon and I need to grow and I need to have space for my employees and I need to move at a very fast pace, I need to know that there's a certain process that yields clarity. If I start a planning exercise 5 years out, I mean, the reality is our business is a business that moves in increments of years. It doesn't move in quarters, it doesn't move in weeks. But to make those decisions the right way, you have to have a lot of certainty because you're investing massive amounts of capital. And so when that relationship works, I think it always provides clarity of process. It's not, well, you could be approved in 4 weeks or you could be approved in 4 years. It has to be, this is the process, this is what you can do, and that there's flexibility built in. So that's kind of the number 2 thing, is that you have to have the clarity and certainty that there is a process that will yield a result, but that you can be flexible around the edges. And saying things like, hey, let's take this building behind us that we were exploring for a multifamily conversion, but we're going to change it back to office because Amazon needs that, but we're still adding, dollars and time to repurpose that building. We're still helping to build up economic vitality and vibrancy. Or it's things like examining our work at Potomac Yard, where we were saying, look, we need to create some lower density forms that we can build now that can get housing into production, that can create critical mass and support retail around this Virginia Tech Innovation Campus. It's not being locked in. Where it doesn't work is saying, there's going to be this massively uncertain, years-long, millions of dollar process that is subject to massive amounts. I'm not against public input, but subject to massive amounts of public input that put a lot of dollars and time at risk. You want to have a defined process, but you also have to have one that says, look, the economic reality has changed. Let's explore converting that building instead of tearing it down, or let's look at reducing something that I know in the grand plan was a 30-story tower to be a 7-story tower, because it's something that we can use to deliver housing and retail today, and move that 30-story tower around the corner. That kind of flexibility and certainty and clarity are the sort of 3 hallmarks of really successful relationship with local government.
So imagine that you're the mayor of a city or a town for a day, and you have a chance to implement some changes. What would be one of the kind of first zoning laws or planning rules that you would change?
I would define timelines. I think it's really important. I would define timelines to say, this is your process, and I would make call it very form-based in a lot of ways is the right way to think about it, but also to say, if you build housing and it fits these general characteristics, that's a public policy priority. I want to see that. Housing production is the only way to drive down housing costs. It's not stopping housing. It's not freezing housing. It's not putting rent control on. It's saying we need production. It's supply and demand like anything else in the world. It's OPEC pumping oil. It's Porsche making cars. It's whatever you think about in any business, it comes down to that. So if I'm the mayor, I want to make sure I can produce housing and I can make it flexible to do that within the right bounds of code and planning and everything else that I want to see in the city. So I would say flexibility around housing production, and I would demand at a certain point that there is a very defined review process, and it's speedy to get to that production point. And I think you look at one of the real success stories here. This Crystal City sector plan was designed to be very flexible. It gave us faith that we could go from office to residential to hotel to other uses all within this neighborhood, as long as the general planning goals were met. It set out really specific guidelines about what we could do on individual sites. It brought clarity, but then the county also stepped up in partnership with Amazon and said, we can give faster review to these projects. If Amazon needs to get people in buildings quickly, we can review it, and you still go through a rigorous code review process, zoning review process, et cetera, but it's set to a time. It doesn't drag on because someone says, well, I would actually like to move the open space to this side. It's bringing that clarity and certainty. That's what I would do if I were the mayor of a town, and I think it will work because it has worked where cities prioritize housing construction. Housing construction is economic development. No company, I used to do site selection work at JLL years ago, no company looks at a market with expensive housing and doesn't factor that into their analysis. They have to see that there is housing for the people they employ at wages they pay that is abundant and delivers good quality of life. That would be my number 1 focus.
Well, that's your ticket then, when the next election cycle comes around.
I think I'll stay where I am, but
Yeah,
I do appreciate that.
So, Evan, you have described the broad plan for this site, for this place. You had that plan, you attracted Amazon, brought them to the table. Tell me about what happened next.
So we announced our deal with Amazon in November of 2018, incredible catalyst. And we started our plans to actually put a lot of that planning into effect, into action. So that meant not only building out spaces for them, but also building out apartments and retail and doing everything we talked about. And so that was going great until March of 2020.
Right.
Big change in the world. And I think, we felt although we couldn't have predicted it, we had been active sellers of office. We had been reducing our office inventory here, but it really pushed us to rethink what we were offering in the neighborhood and how that would function and work. We are always still firm believers that people would still want to gather, they would still want to be together. And that really shaped our thinking because we'd had this plan, which we were putting into effect to build all this housing. We built the first 2 multifamily towers. We started construction on the next 2, which just delivered. So we have about 1,600 new multifamily units. We took the balance of the plan through entitlement to get all the sites ready to go. We started thinking about what was the next wave of office that would come offline. But we also looked hard at our remaining office and our remaining office vacancy and asked ourselves, what do tenants want in a post-COVID environment? And so we spent a lot of time, back to kind of my research background, researching that, asking questions, trying out ideas and thinking, because people were really trying to understand it's not just about removing office inventory. There was still going to be need for office, just not as much as there was before. And so we took a look at our biggest kind of concentration of vacancy, which was in a building called 2011 Crystal Drive. And that building was really kind of archetypal 1980s, big floor plate, ugly aggregate concrete building, and said, let's take some ideas from what we're hearing about what people will want. And we heard a couple things. One is meeting space. You know, one of the coolest conversations I had through this process was with actually Cisco Systems head of real estate. And Cisco's head of real estate gave me this great phrase. He said that offices are not warehouses for people anymore. And I thought that was really cool, coming from a company that makes a lot of data center equipment and things like that. But he really had some incredible data because of what they do, were able to track how people actually used Office. And he said, people never used it as much as you thought they actually did. He showed me all this incredible data that looked at, actually, we have distributed sales teams, we have engineers, people coming and going, doing client meetings. He said the time the office is most used is actually when people are there meeting. So we started to examine and dig in, what does that meeting look like? And it was all about companies shrinking their footprint, not having that warehouse, but they had these need for these big gathering spaces sometimes. You know, you had use the big conference room 3 times a year. You need a hotel ballroom once a year, but the rest of the time you need these other smaller meeting rooms. And so we imagined, how can we take those big meeting rooms out of the office, but keep them in the office building? And look, that's a really fancy way of talking about a conference center in a building. But what we heard from tenants and tenant brokers and others is that a lot of those check-the-box conference amenities, nobody uses them. They don't like them. They're not serviced. And we heard you need people because, you know, when a screen breaks or when you need to have, you know, food brought in, it's a challenge. It's hard to do that. When you go to a hotel, someone takes care of all that. But you don't want to go to a hotel because you don't need room nights. It's out of your office. You don't need to maybe have people stay there. So we built and are about to deliver in January this really big meeting space. And we said this big meeting space has to have small breakout rooms. It has to have really good food. So it has its own kitchen that serves it. It's got to have professional management and staffing. We ran a procurement process to do that. But the idea was, how can you have the big 300-person meeting, but also have the breakout of 100 people into small groups? How can you have the little rooms? How can you have the private dining room? Because we heard over and over again, it's not about having the big space that's empty and not managed in the building. It's having managed, high-quality meeting space. So that was one big one, and we put that into effect. The other one was people wanted outdoor space. They said, within my space, if it's really about convening, I want to work and have some access to the outdoors. You know, I've come from maybe working outside beside my pool or on my apartment balcony for a couple of years. When I go back to the office, I don't want to sit in this hermetically sealed box that meets every kind of green rule. And it's funny, Amazon, one of the most sustainability focused companies on the planet, was insistent that they have operable windows in their space. And this is before any of this happened. And we looked at that and said, well, that's gonna impact your lead scores and it's gonna be energy inefficient and challenging. And they said, we'll figure it out. We'll design these systems to make it still sustainable and work. We have to have opening windows. And that goes all the way to the top, to Jeff Bezos, who wanted to do that. And I thought that was so cool. And we took that learning and that lesson and combined it. So we said, how can we add outdoor spaces? The other thing is, no matter how good your office cafeteria, you know, or the coffee maker is, or, you know, bar, we saw all this investment inside the space. It really kind of became back to that same theme of we need to have places, third places outside of the office, but proximate. When I meet you for a drink, I don't want you to come up to my office and meet me for a drink in my office. It just feels weird. And we found that that was a very human, back to our point before, tendency. And so we learned that if you could provide the third spaces, the meeting places, the F&B, the outdoor spaces, most tenants would shrink their footprint, but they would pay more for that kind of access. They would want to be closer to it. And so we reimagined this building. We have this big meeting facility. We have a kitchen. We have 2 restaurants, a really intimate, you know, wine bar, Italian restaurant that's kind of the fun place to meet for a drink after work, coupled with a much more casual, you know, all-day cafe, coffee shop, prepared food, sort of grab-and-go location that sits right at the foot of the pedestrian bridge to the airport. And so we took a lot of that office building offline to provide those amenities, and we said, let's reimagine everything above it. What we didn't hear was, oh, it needs to be reskinned, and we need to do major surgery on the floor plate. Yes, there are some ideal rules around planning depths, et cetera. People were willing to compromise on that for the other amenities instead. And so what we've been able to do is we really reimagine the first 3 floors to create these tenant outdoor spaces, better glass, newer environments for meeting, et cetera, but then keep the rest of the building largely as is. And I think that's a theme that you're also going to see. It is literally too expensive to take entire buildings and just fully reskin them. You at some point get to a point where the structure is not even worth it. You're really just doing it for the parking, so you may as well just build a new building. It's more about if you can surgically make these interventions, deliver the amenities tenants want. And that's been very successful because not only has it helped us shrink the building from an office perspective, consistent with our theme of reducing office inventory, but it's also allowed us to deliver new amenities and services into the neighborhood that line up with all the retail, all the apartments, all the grocery store, hardware store, all the things we're doing to make it a neighborhood. We're now introducing that transformation of office without fundamentally changing the office space itself.
You mentioned about sustainability while you were talking there, and something that developers, investors, owners, occupiers, everyone's going to have to wrestle with moving forward is developing for a sustainable future and designing places for a sustainable future. How do you see that? How does that impact on a plan for a place like this?
I think at the core of this place is the sustainability blueprint, because you can build a brand new energy efficient building and it can be amazing, but the reality is most of the built environment isn't like that. And I think if we think about things in notions like embedded carbon and the ability to sort of reuse all of the energy and resources that were put into building these buildings in the first place, that needs to continue to get more credit, because I think we need to find ways to recycle, reuse, and adapt versus taking buildings like these, totally scraping them, demolishing them, and yes, building a brand new super energy efficient building. That can happen, but we also need to make sure we think thoughtfully about how these buildings can be repurposed and reused, and that becomes a big component of sustainability, because the reality is we've gone through massive processes that are incredibly extractive to go build these things in the first place. It's wasteful to get rid of them. I think that's a incredibly simplified way of talking about the notion that I think sustainability in a lot of ways gets portrayed as, oh, go build the most energy efficient thing possible. It should also be portrayed as finding ways to adapt and reuse, and also do things in the infill environments where people's commutes are shorter and they have access to public transit. There are a lot of different components to sustainability that I think get ignored sometimes when talking about new development, when infill development can really deliver on those promises.
Talk to me about economic transformation and what that means to you and what that means here in Crystal City.
Sure. So I think, this neighborhood, like we talked about, had gone through this shock with base realignment and closure. And when we came here, we said, well, we need to diversify the anchor away from just the Pentagon. And what's been fascinating is we've seen this shift now where we did that. We brought Amazon, we brought Virginia Tech. But now, just given the global security environment, the defense base is growing. Defense industrial base is becoming incredibly important. But also there's been this seismic shift of defense from legacy technologies like ships and aircraft carriers to really be defense tech focused. And so you think about the growth of companies like Anduril or Palantir, the Shield AI, Saronic, name any of these really advanced, exciting companies at the forefront of defense technology, national security technology. And we found ourselves at an interesting economic crossroads here where our neighborhood has really become a hub in many ways for defense tech. Well, why? Because we have a major research university that focuses on that. We have 6 of the 10 largest recipients of federal defense spending in the neighborhood, the big legacy primes, the Boeings, Northrops, Lockheed, who do incredible engineering work. But then we also have Amazon. So the mixing of those things, we think about this neighborhood becoming in many ways, as Kendall Square is to life sciences, this is to national security and national security technology and defense technology. And that has been an economic macro shift that's happened, especially in our market here in Northern Virginia, but it's something that we found ourselves well equipped to embrace, whether it was through digital infrastructure investments here to create secure fiber networks and public 5G and things like that, to have provisions for on-site compute that's on-prem that you can do in a secure way, to also having partners like this incredible company Nooks, who delivers SCIF as a service, secure spaces as a service. The ability to sort of cater to that audience in terms of their need to do demos, to do R&D, which is kind of the next future of what we're trying to think about here, has been really exciting. And it's been an economic transformation that we couldn't have predicted, but that we were willing to adapt and lean into to help shape this place for that economic nexus of defense and tech that we were perfectly positioned to capture. And I'd say that while you can't do that everywhere, being flexible and leaning into and understanding the needs of customers at the forefront of those kinds of economic transformations that's the way to be really successful. You might be in a market that has historically been really good at doing one thing. Overnight, it will have to be good at doing another. And I'd point at, one of my favorite examples of that is, I think one of the coolest cities in the country that has done a ton to reposition, reimagine is a place like Columbus, Ohio, that's leaned into its manufacturing past and bringing, Anduril's, new forge, bringing Intel's chip fab, bringing massive data center construction, but also improving the place in places like Short North through infrastructure investments to link the university to the economic engine of downtown. They've been really thoughtful, and they've reinvented themselves in life sciences, defense, data center, advanced manufacturing. They've done it in a city that many people had written off entirely, and I think it's incredible to see that. And I think that there are lots of examples where through smart infrastructure investments and agile pivoting and willingness to back the right groups and users and big, bold transformation projects, you can pivot to these economic transformations and get ahead of them.
As you travel around and visit cities and towns, do you find yourself kind of consistent or continuously analyzing them through the lens of the kind of long-term strategy of the real estate and the place? Are you able to switch that off, or is that kind of how you see the world?
I drive. Poor Caroline comes with me. She's always driven a little bit crazy by me talking about block length and the 20 by 20 vision. And well, what if we could just pivot this part? So no, I never turn that part entirely off. I try to do that when I can, but I love cities. I love design. I like thinking about these things, and sometimes I get frustrated when things are done wrong, or I feel like there's a missed opportunity. And I think that, no, I can't turn it off.
And your passion for the subject really comes across. It's absolutely fascinating. I wonder, by way of a kind of final thought, what ideas, what concepts are inspiring you today that you think will inform your decisions that may come to fruition in 5 years, 10 years, even further down the line? What are you seeing out there that's inspiring you?
I think one of the things that really inspires me, and this is sort of a strange one in a lot of ways, is how to rethink suburbs. For a long time, I'm a devout urbanist, like a lot of people in my field, and we were so focused on, what can happen in the city, and I love that. I still always love that. But I think that, we talked about it a little bit, but what can you do with lower density forms? Everyone says, well, it's the big towers and it's the glittering skyline and it's the urban density, and that's great, but most of our country is not covered in, high density cities. So where I draw a lot of inspiration right now, or we're really fascinated, is how can you bring components of the 15-minute city, of the urban grid, of the urban format, the things people like, the gathering places, the third places, how do you take that into the mass-produced American suburb? And I think there are really interesting ways where, when you think about some of these lower density master plan developments, that they're introducing more townhome forms, more multifamily forms, but they're trying to learn how to do retail in a way that translates that urban character into the suburbs. And I think, you see a lot of attempts to do that and little fits and starts over the past 20 years. I think it will be fascinating to see, as we reimagine some of these business parks in particular, how we take the best lessons and learnings of reimagining urban neighborhoods and take that into the suburbs. And that's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, how to bring that quality of life. Because for years we had the great small towns, whether it was here or in Europe. You see amazing little town centers that in many ways struggled and were bypassed, that are now having these resurgences as people have basically diffused across the landscape and choose other places to live and want to bring some of that same energy, or want to access lower housing cost markets. How do you do that in a way that sort of breaks the rules of how a lot of the suburbs have been built for the past 70 years, but embraces some of that human scaled thought process around the small town and that ethos in a way that kind of merges with new development? A lot of different things, but that's an area I'm spending a lot of time thinking about.
So, a couple of quick fire questions just to close out. I'm asking every guest on the show about these three questions. So question one, what's your favorite city or built place on the planet?
Oh man, my favorite city, built place on the planet, I'm gonna have to go, I love London.
London.
I'm not pandering to you.
No, I'm
delighted
to hear it. What an honor. And question two is why? Tell me about what makes London so special. What compels you about London?
I think what's amazing about London is the evolution and the different components of being it's a city that's reinvented itself in so many ways and changed its urban form. And you can find such sort of small, intimate environments that are sort of very neighborhood focused and scaled, and having a city of neighborhoods is what a lot of the way I think about DC, but also with the really extraordinary historical core. And it's trite and cliched as that sounds, it's that mixing and that evolution, that constant reinvention. London feels like a lived in thing that has changed and adapted, but it has never not been relevant. And I think that's what's so extraordinary. World capitals come and go, but London has never not been a relevant place, whether to financial markets, to politics, to history. There's always some way that it's managed to stay relevant, but also stay very personal and very human for so many people. So I love that.
And so the final question is, and I'm really interested to hear your response to this question, given what we just talked about how you see urban places. What would you do to improve London if you could change any one thing about it? What would it be?
This is an interesting one for sure. What would I do to improve it? I think that I would really think about this from the perspective of taking some of the smaller neighborhoods and improving the quality of access to those places. And I say access, I mean thinking about housing cost with housing production. How do you add some density to those neighborhoods? How do you bring them to be they've gotten very expensive in many cases. How do you bring more housing production into those places without shifting their urban character and core? That's one of the things that's hard to think about because London has adapted itself and changed so much. But how do you bring maybe more housing or less expensive housing to really make sure that those places stay sustainable over time, but that doesn't shift their fundamental character? And that's an almost impossible challenge in any city. But I think it's especially hard in London in so many ways because it's not just about scrape a couple office towers and put in some housing or do some conversions, because there are so many amazing residential neighborhoods that are in many ways their own little microcosms of London that have their own distinct cultural characteristics. I think that's what's so fundamentally hard. And what I would want to improve is making those places more accessible and more vibrant, but at the same time, I don't know how you do that without fundamentally altering their character. I think that's one of the things that would be so difficult and challenging to sink your teeth into.
Well, Evan, it's been fantastic to speak with you. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your vision for this place and the story so far. And I just think it's absolutely fascinating stuff. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for joining me. Thanks for being a great host.
Thank you also to you, our viewers, our listeners, for joining us on another episode of In the Loop. And a big thank you to our guest today, Evan Regan Levine, Chief Strategy Officer at JBG Smith. Do join us again next time for another episode. See you then. We don't want you to miss an episode, so don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow In the Loop on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. And while you're there, leave us a review and a rating, and don't forget to recommend the show to a fellow commercial real estate geek.